Okay. You ready for part 2?
Let's do it. JP, baby.
For those listening, we're going to do a reactions and thoughts to Jordan Peterson's lecture, Doctors and Psychotherapists, Butchers and Liars. This is part 2. So if you haven't listened to part 1, we recommend going back to the last episode and check that out, because we're going to take basically from like the halfway point now and continue. Yes. Let's go.
Let's do it.
I am focusing on the American Psychological Association, APA, because it is the body charged with establishing.
Why does he got to say everything with such contempt?
Yeah, I don't know. When you really hate someone, it's like he'll emphasize it. APA.
We're like 6.5 minutes, and it's just like he hates everybody.
Butchers and liars. I mean, doctors. It's like I love. It's like.
We talked about this in the last episode, just how inflammatory the language is, but it's like, no doubt he's frustrated with the APA, and to be frank, so am I, and I'm sure. Me too.
I have a lot of frustration with it. Agreed.
But when you come at it with that language and that tone, then what else do you say to that? Like, if you're part of the APA, you definitely don't want to start a conversation with Dr. Peterson.
At least he's opening the conversation.
Yeah, if you want to call it that. Okay.
Some of their guidelines are appalling enough to deserve dissection. Guideline 1. Psychologists understand that gender is a non-binary construct that allows for a range of gender identities, and that a person's gender identity may not align with sex assigned at birth. I don't understand this radical postmodern definition of gender, one that rests on a person's deeply felt or inherent sense of being one sex over another, regardless of biology. Psychologically, it is indisputably the case that a non-trivial proportion of males have a feminine temperament, which essentially means that they experience higher levels of negative emotion, such as anxiety and the analogs of pain, grief, frustration, disappointment, depression, and are more agreeable, compassionate, polite than typical males. And equally true that a non-trivial proportion of females have a masculine temperament. But this does not change how, objectively, professionals should measure a person's gender.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, in terms of the definition that they placed on gender identity?
Yeah, so he brought up the example. So he's saying that gender should be based on sex only. Right, because
is that what he was saying, or is that?
Yeah, because the whole definition, what he was saying from Great Britain, is that gender is non-binary, meaning that there's a spectrum of what gender is that goes beyond sex. And then his argument was, no, that's stupid. It's actually based on sex and sex alone. So when he was giving the description, yes, you have women that can have stereotypical masculine traits and have all these things. Similarly, you have men that have these typically feminine traits, but that leads to depression, that leads to anxiety, that leads to this. So that's what I'm saying. Like, the whole construct of his argument, it should be at church. That should be separated out, the religious beliefs aside. And then I wish this was just more about breaking things down. You know, gender identification surgery should be done. It shouldn't be done when you're a kid. These are the reasons why. Medically, as a profession, there's so many things wrong that's going on with the APA, psychology, psychotherapists in general. I wish it would be more about that.
Yeah, I didn't have an issue with the definition of, he brought up the definition from the APA of gender. In fact, why don't we just replay that piece?
Psychologists understand that gender is a non-binary construct that allows for a range of gender identities, and that a person's gender identity may not align with sex assigned at birth.
He's reading that as if it's completely wrong, yet I'm not seeing anything wrong with that guideline. That gender identity can be free from somebody's sexual identity, like from their sex.
And this is a huge distinction that people like mix up. Like, people say sex and gender are the same thing. They're not. Mm-hmm. Sex is biological, gender is cultural. Mm-hmm. So when you're saying gender, you're not talking about the physical differences. You're talking about a cultural perspective in terms of how you see yourself.
Yeah, and those are just terms that we're using to label it, right? Because it's very easy to mix up those terms. But what we're really trying to differentiate in those terms is simply a biological function versus an identity function. Someone's sexual identity versus their biological, and I almost feel like it's flip-flopped. Biological gender makes more sense to me as the physical piece, and the sexual identity makes more sense to me as the, you know, the feeling, the emotional, the identity piece of that equation. But that's all that's happening is we're trying to define two words. And the APA went about that and said that someone's, I don't know if he has issue with the terms that are being used, like gender being used for that, or what it is, but what they're saying was just that a person can have an identity that is not conforming to their physical sex.
Yeah, and he's saying no.
And he's saying that's what it sounds like. He's saying no.
He's saying no. It's if you're male, you're male. If you're female, you're female. That's it. And then his argument, if you listen post when he talked about, yes, you have these typical behaviors with males that's considered feminine, and they're polite, and they're this and this and this and this, which leads to depression, anxiety. Yeah. What is his argument? That this kind of gender spectrum actually leads you to become more depressed, possibly suicidal.
So if we're interpreting that piece correct, I would say that that's the first hyper-religious piece that I've heard in this, is that from this issue that he has with that description, and then from the following where he's saying basically that you can be a woman and have masculine traits, and you can be a man and have feminine traits, it sounds like he's going in the direction of saying that gender and sex are the same thing, that you cannot. It almost sounds like when 20, 30 years ago, this is still occurring today, but when people of a religious background say that you can't be born gay, that you can't, that you're mistaken, that this is a psychological problem, it's a sickness. That's what this sounds like here.
Yeah, that it's cultural, and it's because of this, his use of language, the far left, that's what's creating this confusion. And we just need to go back to biology.
Yeah.
Right? Like Native Americans, like historically, when you look at their, when tribes and all this, sexuality was never an issue in their culture. Mm-hmm. Some people, if you felt homosexual, if you, take the stereotypes that maybe this male is more feminine or this female is more masculine, whatever the case may be, they just accepted it. They considered it a spiritual construct. Mm-hmm. So there was an accepting of it, versus here, if you want to argue that it's non-accepting, fine. Or there has to be more understanding about it, fine. But I feel like his tone here is that he's really digging into his religious stance.
Yeah. What's interesting too about those you brought up these tribes, and in many of these tribes, men and women take on each other's roles, like the roles that you would traditionally in Western society or whatever we have, you would say, oh, well, the man's going to do more of the physical labor and the hunting and the gathering and that. No, you actually find that in these tribes, they reverse roles. Like a lot of the women are hunters.
Yeah, like the New Guinea tribe. So this is like the birth of feminism, is they base it off of studies of tribes in New Guinea, where you had like the stereotypical male roles. They were done by the women. The women were the hunters. Mm-hmm. They are the gatherers. They're the very aggressive ones. And then the men were giggling and, the stereotypical female roles.
That sounds kind of sexy though. Let's be honest. Women are
it was reversed, which showed that, there's biological components, but there's also a cultural component to it too.
Yeah, this is the first place that I have major issue with kind of what's being said and how it's being said. I don't know if we've interpreted it correctly, but that's where it sounds like it's going. So maybe we can go back to that place where he starts talking about the roles of men and women taking on each other's traits.
Psychologically, it is indisputably the case that a non-trivial proportion of males have a feminine temperament, which essentially means that they experience higher levels of negative emotion, such as anxiety and the analogs of pain, grief, frustration, disappointment, depression, and are more agreeable, compassionate, polite than typical males. And equally true that a non-trivial proportion of females have a masculine temperament. But this does not change how, objectively, professionals should measure a person's gender.
There's some horseshit in that conversation right there. This is one of the places where I don't understand. Given his level of intelligence, when he says that a masculine portion or a large portion of men display feminine attributes, he talks about social constructs nonstop throughout his books, throughout everything that he does. And yet he's not recognizing that the roles of these traits are part of that social construct. Like he labels anxiety and what was it? Fear and as feminine traits.
Feminine traits, politeness,
being
compassionate,
agreeableness,
which leads to negative thoughts and leads to depression if you're a male.
That is incredibly strange to me. And then on the opposite side, he labels masculine traits as aggression.
Yeah.
And these are things that anybody can feel.
But this is the other thing too. He used the language non-traditional, meaning this is not the norm. If you're a male and you show compassion and you're more stereotypically feminine, there's something wrong with you. Like you're going to have more depression and you're going to have more negative thoughts about yourself.
Yeah.
So once again, like it gives a very limiting view. Like he's just either male, female. That's pretty much it. Gender's a non-issue.
Well, and the funny thing is that those traits that were listed as feminine were, I mean, by and large, negative traits. Maybe the politeness could be considered positive. But he's saying things like you're emotional, you're anxiety, you're depressed, and then on the masculine side, those are mostly by and large positive traits. Like you would say that being aggressive for the most part is like a decent thing, unless you're overly aggressive. But the way that it's labeled seems so.
Well, I find it hypocritical because his whole argument is that you have the APA, they're putting everything into this box, right? And that we're not evolving as a society and we're actually going backwards. But then when he comes back to the issue of sexuality and gender, he's going backwards.
Yeah, he just boxed it
right?
himself.
There's no evolution.
Yeah, that's odd.
Like, why can't we evolve where like stereotypical male and female traits can be assigned to all people? Like this, that's just who you are. Like you're embracing all sides of yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's really what it should be. I mean, when we're talking about these different traits, it makes sense to me to say that some of these traits would appear more often in men and some of them would appear more often in women. But to label them and basically to say like, I don't know where he's getting at with this point, because what the APA had described in that guideline 1 was very real, that someone's identity, the way that they identify themselves could be different than their physical sex. That is very real. And now we've muddied that whole argument with all these strange labels of what it is to be male and female.
Yeah. Well, I don't find it that confusing because when the way he started the lecture, he made it clear where he stands. So everything's going to fit within that lens. So then to sparse it out, well, let's give him a break here. Well, you just look at the totality of it. Like that's his whole core message.
I'm starting to see what you're saying more in that, because I'm trying to give him a break on this because I kind of feel like, well, a lot of your other points were really good. And then now you're starting to lose me. But you're right that like this whole thing has kind of been from the guise of a religious and spiritual standpoint as opposed to like a scientific one. But it's weird. It's mixed. It's like he's coming at it as if it's science, but then there's so much religion involved.
You know, it's a weird space. Like, for example, like I think I mentioned this before, but like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I went to a wedding, Christian wedding. They're a Christian family. The wife is a doctor. She works. She makes all the money. The husband doesn't work, stays at home, drops the kids off, he plays soccer. He doesn't do, I mean, he's a nice person, but he doesn't work. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't even help around the house. And we were at that wedding. You had the Christian side and you had the non-Christian side. And then the guy, the preacher, he was reading from the Bible. The female must always follow the man and do whatever the man says. And then you can hear a gasp on the non-Christian side, like this guy doesn't even work or do anything, but she needs to follow him. And you can hear this gasp, right? But on the other side, like, yeah, of course, man, this is what you got to do, right? So it was just this distinction, like, really, like she has to conform to him, even though she's working, making all the money.
That's
like,
hilarious.
Really? Like, and then you want to talk about confusion. Okay, so if she takes more of the feminine roles under this argument, that she's going to be happier? Mm-hmm. Really?
Yeah, very strange.
Try reading, for example, a document published by the APA itself in 2014, where you will learn that a psychologist worthy of his salt is obliged to utilize constructs, i.e. terms such as gender, in a technically appropriate manner. This means at the very least that fundamental attributes must be measurable and measured properly. But all that goes out the window when we're discussing the magic of gender now, which is entirely subjectively defined, even though that insistence indubitably contravenes the earlier standards. But feelings über alles, folks, and it's no joke, particularly if you're 15 and have undergone surgery that makes you incapable of reproducing, often to foster someone else's sense of moral superiority or sense of self-attributed compassion, a word that increasingly makes me shudder when I encounter it. New doctrines.
It seemed like you had a thought there.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts.
Give it to me.
So number one, I agree with what he's saying. And this, when he's saying, when you're a psychologist or you're a professional, you can't automatically assume and take the stance that you are an expert, right? I 100% agree with that. Like on the news, when you have this Caucasian man representing, I am the expert on North Korea, or I'm the expert on Korea because I've studied books and I'm assigned this role. That is, you're not an expert. You're ridiculous. Have some humility. You have knowledge, but you're not an expert unless you've actually lived there and been there, right? There's a ridiculousness with that. I agree with that, right? And pointing that out and saying you're going to be the moral authority, I 100% agree. At the same time, he's acting the same thing that he's complaining about. Yeah. He's taking the same stance and he's doing the damn same thing. And he's all, don't show compassion. Well, you're not really showing compassion. You have no self-awareness. Lack of compassion means you have lack of a self-awareness about yourself.
Yeah, there's a bit of a narcissistic vibe in a lot of the things that he's saying and doing, because it's hypocritical.
It's hypocritical. He's not seeing his own hypocrisy.
So
maybe practice some non-traditional roles, bro.
And before people blow us up and like, you just called Jordan Peterson a narcissist, I feel like there's going to be someone that blows us up and says that. Actually, narcissism is a spectrum, and we've talked about this many times.
Spectrum. There's a range. There's always a range to everything. And then anything that's absolute, people that argue have a very narrow view of things. And it's reflected. And they're just holding on to that narrow view that they have.
What I think is, I do believe that it is, it's a person's narcissistic tendencies that allows them to hold a course of belief and actions in the face of everyone that says anything otherwise. And you see that very clearly with Jordan, how he's able to ignore and just like kind of continue on his way. And I think that that's a very important trait and ability. And I do believe that it should be tempered with, like you said, empathy and compassion, and to be able to see the other sides. But by and large, the voice that we hear is one that I feel like needs to be heard. Not, again, I'm saying that also coming from our conversation here of like, a lot of the things he's saying are hyper-religious, things that we don't believe with, but that it's starting a conversation that needs to be had. And every voice in this conversation is worth having. And I see that as incredibly valuable. But at the same time, I do agree that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the way that he's approaching this, considering his role as a psychotherapist.
And a professor, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, I respect his opinion. I respect where he's coming from. I understand his stance and point of view, like his beliefs are coming out. That's great. I just feel like in this lens, it could be done within the Christian community. Like, take some of that out and then just make it about gender reassignment. Make it about what the APA is doing.
Well, funny enough, if you actually listen to his Christian lectures and compare it to this, he has taken plenty out.
Oh, really?
He's taken tons out.
I don't know too much about him, but is he hyper-religious?
I don't know that I would say he's hyper-religious, but he has these like religious debates that he'll bring he is very much of the stance that like Christianity is the way, that the Bible is the truth, but not necessarily the truth in terms of like the way that like most people perceive the truth as like what is scientifically true. He perceived it as more like, this is what everything is based off of. It's true in the sense that this has had more influence and more effect, but he is very much Christian, and most of that rhetoric has been removed. So what you're detecting is funny, because if you were to listen to those other lectures, it's 1,000 times more than this. So
yeah,
but yeah, you're absolutely right though. Go ahead and play.
Revolutionary doctrine of intersectionality without question. And what is that doctrine? Nothing more than the claim that human beings are characterized by identities that span multiple dimensions.
That's
Any
true.
given person has a race, ethnicity, sex, temperament, 5 dimensions there alone, intelligence level, etc. We've known that forever. It's only became a hot cultural item since fools noted the obvious fact that minority status might be additive or multiplicative. I hate to even point out, given that anyone with any sense whatsoever also knew without any statistical training that it was possible to be of Latino extraction, say, or even Latin X, to use that absurd, demeaning, and patronizing term, and female simultaneously. One cannot question this, however, without fear of being ostracized by one's colleagues.
What is this term Latin X? I'm unfamiliar with that. Do you know that term?
I'm not too familiar, but it's expanding out what it means to be Latino.
Okay. Well, I generally agree with everything that was said there, right? Like that.
I completely disagree.
Wait.
He talked about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a construct that there's multiple layers to things that are going on, that it basically shows that there's systemic issues in society when it comes to culture. So for example, if you're at work, you go to work, you're the boss here, but you go to work, and let's say you're not the boss, and you experience racism or discrimination, you can say that it's only happening to you, right? Intersectionality is saying that you are experiencing racism at your job, but it's also intersecting with the components of the culture of the company, right? It's factoring to societal norms, so that when you're feeling so much pressure, it's not just because you're just experiencing with these few individuals. It's this intersection of components that's taking place in your life as a minority. I completely agree with that. He's saying that's horseshit.
I didn't get that from this. I thought that what he's doing right now is saying that one's identity is composed of intersectionality between.
He talked about the term intersection. The term intersectionality is basically, it's a construct of defining what it's like to be a minority. So when people are saying like, dude, everything is equal, bro. You have equal chances. I have equal chances. It's equal. No, it actually isn't, because there's other components as a minority that you have to go through that if you're part of the majority, you don't really understand or experience. That is, to me, is factual. And he's saying that's horseshit. So let's break his argument down. From the time he's basically saying all of these gender issues is basically from a spiritual construct, a sin, right? And he's breaking it down why. And then you break down killing babies. Gender reassignment falls under that norm because you're sacrificing for the gods, which goes against this whole Christian sect, right? And then sex itself is purely biological. Anything that you do that's considered non-traditional, where people have range of emotions, you're going to become depressed and sick, right? And then ultimately, when you're taking gender, because gender is a cultural perspective, the concept of intersectionality, that if you experience racism at school, it's not just the school, there's a systemic issue involved, and all these things are intersecting. He's saying no.
I want to go back to an earlier point that I think I said in the last episode. My only problem, well, I have disagreements with, I disagree on some of the things that Jordan Peterson says, plenty of the things that he says. But my only major issue is in the way that he says things, because I said in that episode that I find myself having to listen and re-listen because the subjects and the terms that he's using are so incredibly abstract and difficult to piece things together. I tried listening to the book, and I sat there. I think I've attempted 100 times to get through his 12 rules for life. And the only time I very much can resonate and understand what he's saying is when he's talking to somebody and simplifying, like when he goes on to a podcast, when he goes on to a show and whatnot. And even then I have to listen and re-listen. And this is one of those pieces that I want to, again, re-listen to, because I don't know if I'm understanding it the same way that you are.
But he said intersectionality, the gender one. Let's break the argument down. Gender, he's saying, which is remember I gave sex is biological, gender is cultural. So when he read the APA guidelines, and they specifically said that it's non-binary, which has a range, and it's devoid of sex, devoid of your physical, how you are physically, biologically male or female. He said no. And then he gave the argument. And then now he's going to the construct of intersectionality. Intersectionality, once again, I'll give another example. If you're female and you get paid less than your male counterparts, and you're a minority, and you go to work and you experience sexual discrimination, or you experience discrimination, it's not just with the boss. You're a female, you're a minority, your position at work, right? The norms of that company culture, the norms of that society, all of those things intersect and come into play in that circumstance. It's you can't just narrow it down to, well, it's just this work situation. It's just it's just here. If it's a systemic issue, that is what intersectionality means.
And what are you saying that he's claiming?
He's saying that that's horseshit. He's saying intersection, like basically like intersection, not even for gender, like gender is an evolving thing. Like it's something that we're learning, right? So through this process, using intersectionality, you have to combine all the different components: society, knowledge, education, and it has to systemically, it's intersecting on all these different levels, and that's why there's so many issues with it. And he's saying, and that's the argument of intersectionality. When you're in a minority, it's not just adjusting to culture and just it's an individual journey. There are systemic issues that are intersecting, that are creating issues for you. And if you don't identify that, things are not going to change. His argument. That argument of intersectionality when it comes to gender is horseshit. Just go back to male, female, traditional. That's it.
I am not getting that at all. I want to actually listen to this piece one more time.
It's only became a hot cultural item since fools noted the obvious fact that minority status might be additive or multiplicative. I hate to even point out, given that anyone with any sense whatsoever also knew, without any statistical training, that it was possible to be of Latino extraction, say, or even Latin X, to use that absurd, demeaning, and patronizing term, and female simultaneously. One cannot question this, however, without fear of being ostracized by one's colleagues. Note the chilling wording of Guideline 7. Psychologists understand the need to promote social change that reduces the negative effects of stigma on the health and well-being of TGNC people. In summary, if you're not an activist and one of our activists, then you better be watching over your shoulder.
His message gets so freaking muddied in the words, man. This is why I go back to there's a gauge in my mind of intelligence. There's not very smart, there's being book smart, there's being of high intelligence where, you know, someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson, where you've studied and you've done all these things and you can have these incredible conversations and do research and do all this. And in my opinion, there's the highest level, which is you are that in the sense of you have all of that information. You can do all the studies, you understand this, but you can break things down in a way that those without that experience can internalize and make it useful to them. And I feel like that level of intelligence is missing here because I still don't understand that point that he's made.
Yeah, so to me, like, it's clear.
To you, it's clear.
To me, it's clear. Like, he's using language that's consistent with psychology, that's consistent with terminologies, that's consistent with the guidelines. He's being very clear to me. And then once again, when he talked about cultural multi-dimensions, which is what intersectionality is, he's saying, no, this is horseshit.
I heard him say that when it comes to, I heard him say that on the topic of, like, we've known without any studies that you can be feminine and Latin and you can be all of these things together. That's what I heard.
No, but intersectionality is saying that that's when, instead of just looking at racism, like this individual thing, it's where all things intersect. Gender, culture, socioeconomic status, you know, if you have any like types of disabilities, all these things that are coming into play at that point where it all intersects is where you can define the problem. That's a cultural issue. That's basically, it's saying that if you're in society as a whole, you can't just reduce it into one thing. It's where all social norms and issues intersect. And when you can see it, then you can see it in totality. He is saying no. And then when you're coming to the issue of gender, it's because we're intersecting it all that it's causing all this chaos and confusion, which is coming up with terms LGBTQ and this and this and this and transgender. it's the intersection that's causing all this chaos. Let's go back to just doing what's normal and rational.
Interesting. Well, I don't know enough about what he's actually saying to debate or agree or disagree with that. So I'm not going to re-listen to it again. I feel like I'm reading his GD book all over again. So
I mean, at least that's how I'm hearing it. Maybe I'm not saying 100%, but this is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Well, let's keep going and see what his how he should guide his own guideline for his behavior. I think that's what he was about to get into.
So what should govern my behavior as a therapist and your expectations as a client? The answer to that is whatever the activists deem a priority at their whim. And remember that in court, folks. Active malevolence. I'm increasingly ashamed to be a clinical psychologist given the utter cowardice, spinelessness, and apathy that characterizes many colleagues and even more so my professional associations.
I agree with both those things that were said right there, where it does feel like societal, I mean, it feels like we talk about what's relevant is what people make the biggest noise about. That is frustrating because I want, like anybody, I would want societal change and improvement and whatnot, but it is frustrating that the entire conversation just follows whoever screams the loudest. Because for all the people that are not currently being served, I guess, by an agenda, they're not being discussed at all. Like if it's not in the popular media, if it's not part of this conversation and being politicized, then literally nothing is being done for that. And that's what I felt like, growing up in Utah as the only Iranian kid, that's what I felt like. Nobody gave a shit about the racism, about all the things going on during the Gulf War. If you've been Middle Eastern through the Gulf War in the States or during 9/11, nobody gave a shit. In fact, where was all the activism? When in recent years, we've had social media and all this kind of stuff 20 years ago that really didn't exist, right? So all the people that were getting beaten and brutalized, the Middle Easterns that were, or even if you looked that way after 9/11, they didn't have a voice. And it wasn't politicized because it didn't need to be, right? Things get politicized because it can help somebody's movement towards presidency or getting a Senate seat or whatever it might be. But if it doesn't have an effect in the popular culture, then that doesn't.
Yeah, if it doesn't get news, then it's not going to be discussed or addressed. Yeah.
So in recent years, because of all this, the loudest, so everybody, each of these movements goes about creating the loudest noise possible. And then that becomes the sole attention, and everybody that's not part of that movement is basically ignored.
And you're bringing up what I feel like he's saying. So like, for example, like when you grew up, using the concept of intersectionality, if you went to your counselor and you're like, dude, I'm experiencing like racism and this is horrible. Like, dude, bro, you gotta work on your coping skills. Versus like, you're the only Iranian kid there. Mm-hmm. You're in a Mormon. So this is an intersection. You're the only Iranian kid, Mormon culture, right? Your socioeconomic status, and then Gulf War going on. And all of those things are combining. And if you're like, it's getting more intense, the bullying's getting, well, you got to have better coping skills versus like it's happening because all these things are intersecting for you. And this is where the problem lies. That is how to address a minority or a person that's suffering from this cultural lens. Correct. That would be the appropriate approach for you. Now he's going back to saying when you're dealing with like transgenders, we're doing all this. And that approach is what's causing all these problems. Right. And he's saying that's not actually the answer. We need to go back and just go back to basic sex, gender, male, female, go back to traditional norms of what's considered appropriate. That's his solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, his point there was whatever is being discussed is what I will.
That's what he's saying. So gender is being sensationalized. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's getting all this play because it's just getting the most noise. And he's saying, let's cut the bullshit noise on this. This is what I'm hearing from him.
That's what I'm getting to.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that piece because I believe that it needs to be part of the conversation. And I think that the APA has actually done some decent guidelines in that area, and that those conversations, like I agree from this standpoint.
I agree that there's you know, if you want to have a priority list of things that should get more attention, yeah, I can agree with that. Climate change, right? I mean, there's a lot of bigger issues that should have more, that we should be talking about. And then if you want to argue that maybe this is lower on the priority list, yeah, I'm cool with that. But that's not what he's saying. I mean, he's saying, if you listen to the whole totality, like I get,
it's basically that none of this stuff matters.
I feel like you like him so much that you're trying to redeem and say like, okay, but he means this here and he means this here, versus, and if you just listen and be objective, like his whole views are coming out. I mean, you could sparse arguments, I guess, and like, well, he's trying to be reasonable here. He's being reasonable to his argument.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Okay, there was a second point in there, but I totally forgot what that second point was.
Like, I don't know that, like, I never, like, even when you told me Butcher, I didn't know what the hell we were watching, right? This is the first time I've actually, like, listened to him.
That's the point.
Yeah.
That's the point.
At least in 20 years, when we all come to regret this terrible social experiment, I may be able to say, I said no when they all came to insist that we participate in the sacrifice of our children.
I remember what the second point was. He said that he is increasingly ashamed to be a part of this industry or to be a part of this profession with the spinelessness of his colleagues. And I do 1000% agree with that. I feel like not enough people... Look, this guy's been ridiculed, shamed, everything, right? Death threats, all of that stuff. But he says what he believes. And you even said that you appreciate the fact that he says what
I totally agree. I respect that he takes his stance.
Correct.
That's great.
Regardless of what that stance is, that is respectable. And what I absolutely despise is how many people change and flip-flop and adjust their stance, not because they actually have changed or because they actually believe something, but because they're doing it just so that they don't get criticized.
Okay. Once again, though, I feel like you like him so much that you're a very rational guy, man. Like, you create, like, your whole business model, how you learn Cantonese, and man, it's based on like systems and learning, right? But sometimes when it comes to, like, this is the example of like why, like you mentioned, like, dude, he's such a smart guy and all this, but then yeah, his religion gets in the way. He can't see himself, because when you're dealing with people you like or human relationships, it kind of skews things, right? I feel like you always want to apologize for this guy and try to give him the benefit of the doubt. Like, there's nothing, like, he's smart as hell. I respect him. He's calling out a lot of things, but my thing is, like, to me, it's clear his whole intent is to go back into this kind of religious society, and veering away from it, that's what's causing all this chaos. And then he's making very strong statements in the sense of, like, to me, he brought up killing of babies. Like, the whole point is he's saying gender reassignment, all this is similar to killing babies. It's irresponsible. And the whole point of why this is happening is because of intersectionality. This construct of studying cultures and saying that all these things intersect, it's just chaos and confusion coming from the far left. And ultimately, let's just go back to male, female, traditional roles, and everything else will be fine. And if you don't take a stand on that, you're a goddamn coward. I don't agree with that. I think, don't get me wrong, people do things because they're afraid, but maybe just people don't know. And then they're not taking such a hard stance, like, this is the absolute and I'm with you, bro, versus I don't know. And maybe they have friends and they see the confusion and the pain that they're going through, and they're just trying to understand. They're taking the stance of, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't disagree with you that I do have a bias towards Jordan Peterson. I like him. Not for the reasons that you might think. It's not because I like Jordan Peterson because he says what he believes and he stand-ups for it. And if he changes his mind on something, I don't know whether he does or will. I would assume that he does, because it sounds like in his lectures and stuff, there are things that he will, adopt. And I think that's the mark of any good intellectual, right? They should be changing their mind as they learn things. But what I really appreciate is the fact that he just speaks and he's not afraid of the criticism.
I respect that.
But I'm listening to what you say. Like, I'm like, okay, well, yeah, you've pointed out very good things.
But you're a very reasonable person, though. Like, let me. Like,
I am so reasonable that I'm sitting here saying you're right.
But let me ask you this: like, do you feel like okay, so let's kind of go back, like, because you're like, oh, you're sparsing his whole overall argument is that this is ridiculous. Let's go back to a traditional male and female sex. That culture, when it comes to like transgenders and this whole construct, this binary, non-binary construct of gender, that this is a ridiculous thing. That is what he's saying.
I still don't know if I don't know that I can get to that place from this or
but
from anything that I've heard.
He just read the psychological.
So is this me being biased?
Like how? Like he just read it, and then he gave a very educational argument. He basically said, "This is a cultural intersectionality and culture where the construct of like minority struggles, the point of intersection and dissect. This is the cause of all the problems."
Interesting.
Like,
I'm very curious. So this is where I would say, if you're listening to this, send us a DM on Instagram or comment on the video, wherever it might be, and let us know what your take on this. Because I'm so confused, because I am wrapping my head around this idea of like, when we're talking about these surgeries done in adolescence, in pre-puberty, that's what I thought the whole purpose of this was, that we shouldn't conform an entire profession to simply what's popular right now. That this conversation is having such a huge impact, such broad impact, that we're changing, APA guidelines to the point where we're saying that we should, deny or affirm or whatever it might be, or basically that we should affirm, transgender in pre-pubescent children. That is what I'm taking from this. And I hear a lot of it getting muddied up. I agree with you 1000%. That message is being muddied up by his religious background. That message is being muddied up by his own personal beliefs. It's being muddied up by just his goddamn language. Like, simplify things. If there was anything, like if Jordan were listening to this, I would just say, you are a very intelligent person. And the next level for you is make it more easily understood. Make your message more easily understood.
But to me, it's very clear. Like, I mean, this is where like.
But do you feel like your own bias might be influencing that too? Because
I have never listened to this guy this intently.
No, I'm saying because you're picking up so much religious vibe from it.
No,
right?
but okay, but yeah, the religious vibe. But you're not listening. This is where I think you're. I'm not, dude. I said I like him. I've never listened to it. He's making it's like listening to a lecture, and then he's making his points. He's piecing his argument piece by piece, and it's very clear to me.
Okay.
Like, I don't dislike the guy. I have a lot of Christian friends. Like, I respect people's. I'm just saying, okay, like that. Wow, that's a very strong argument.
Well,
and
if he's saying it, if your interpretation of what he's saying is on point, and I'm going to say that you probably are seeing this from a clearer lens than I am, then I would say, yes, it's disgusting. That is a completely incorrect way of viewing the issue and discussing the issue.
And what I'm saying is the points that you're picking up, yes, he's saying that, but his argument for why it's happening and his argument for how this needs to be corrected, that's the point that I don't think you're really absorbing.
Well, I guess what I'm doing is I'm internalizing the messages of what's being said and putting it into my own language and my own approach to it. So I do believe that like there is an oversensitivity and conformity that's happening because of these conversations. And that's the piece that I'm solely focused on. I do believe that prepubescent, sex changes is a really bad idea. And that's what I'm focusing on. I'm basically, like, have you ever heard of this concept? Anybody that goes to church, right? You go to whatever church, whatever religion, doesn't matter. It's like going to a spiritual buffet. You go into a buffet, you pick and choose the things that you want, right? You can say that you're Mormon, you can say that you're Muslim, you can say that you're whatever the hell that you are, but there is no way that you agree with every single thing that's being taught or shared.
Agreed.
And what you're doing instead is you're kind of walking into the church and you're going, this spiritual buffet is nice, and I'm going to pick and choose this one, and I'm going to take this one, and this one's nice, and I'm going to leave all the other stuff like in the tray. And that's exactly what I'm doing with his lecture. And really, it's not just his lecture. It's like anytime I'm listening to anybody speak, I'm approaching it from the standpoint of a spiritual or knowledge buffet, where I'm going to pick and choose the things that I want and put them on my plate in the amounts that I want, and I'm going to leave everything else on the table. And I will agree with you 1000% that I'm leaving a lot of what he said in the buffet. I'm not touching it because I don't agree with it.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I respect his outspokenness. I hear his points. But the points, the way that you're explaining it to me, like, well, he's really trying to change this because of this. The reasons I don't.
No, you're probably right. He's probably going at this because of a very firm religious belief and background as opposed to like.
But he's basically saying, let's get rid of the construct of intersectionality and let's get rid of the construct of all the cultural components that can affect a person's life. That's a huge stance.
I couldn't understand that section of his lecture well enough to agree or disagree with your take on it.
So,
but if that's what he's saying, that's insane. Because we all know that like intersectionality matters. Like those things matter. The experience that I had in Utah, like what are you gonna go and tell me? And I have had counselors and people tell me before that, you just need to get stronger and you need to have better coping skills and you need to learn how to communicate your feelings. And I'm like, motherfucker, there's a guy that's jumping on my back and beating me and you want me to like talk to him more?
Yeah, it's on the news every day, bitch. Like the news is the news. This is what's killing me right now.
So if you can't see that that a person's experience is a cross section of all the different things that make up who they are, where they live, that's insane. I don't know if that's what he's actually saying though. And we have 2 minutes left.
Okay, let's finish this off.
This has been my favorite conversation with you ever.
Oh, really? By the way.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because you are actually like, you're challenging me and I appreciate that.
Because most of the time we agree.
Calling me out.
Most of the time we agree though.
We do.
Yeah. Most of the time. So.
I'm still agreeing with you.
I'm agreeing with you too. Like, let's go.
Let's keep going.
Other countries, and Britain in particular, must not make the same mistakes as in the US and elsewhere. I cannot consent to what we are doing. I cannot abide by what have become the doctrines of my discipline. I believe that the acts of the medical professional rushing to disfigure, sterilize, and harm young people with what are clearly ill-advised, dangerous, and experimental procedures cross the line from do no harm to outright harm. Only if we bury our heads in the sand will sterility, impaired or absent sexual function, complex reactions to poorly understood hormones, expense, and intermingled with all of that, misery and confusion continue for countless young people. We must address the threat posed to the integrity of the entire education system, as well as indoctrination into the same philosophy that spawned this surgical enterprise and the APA guidelines grows. It threatens general public trust that our peace and prosperity depends upon.
I feel like I'm doing the buffet thing again, because I don't agree with the way that he said that, but I do. But like, there is a sense of, yes, it is not a good thing to indoctrinate any form of philosophy or ideology through the school system, which is actually happening. I do agree with, prepubescence, going and doing permanent surgical procedures is doing more harm than it is doing good. I believe that we're not addressing the actual root issues. I don't know that he is either, because based on what you said just a second ago, where he's dismissing intersectionality, if that is true, then he's not approaching it from the same standpoint that I would be. But in general, I agree with the points of what was said right there.
Yeah, I mean, once again, I agree. There needs to be changes. There needs to be better training. There needs to be a discussion on like gender reassignment, like the age of appropriateness. What's the long-term effects of doing this? Everything he's saying, I agree. Like, I'm with that. It's just everything, the reasons that he's giving behind it. It's like me telling you, bro, we gotta love everybody. Bro, and I go, love and peace exist, bro. And you're like, yo, I agree with you, right? Love and peace exist, bro. But why? Because everyone that's not Korean needs to be killed. and then
like, holy shit.
If you keep that's the intent behind it. But I'm like, dude, you gotta love our brothers though, because they're hurting and they're suffering. If that's my intent, there's like, it's a weird reason, right?
Or if I'm like, yeah, we gotta we got to improve society because there was a man 10,000 years ago who left us on a spaceship and started this planet. and I went into Scientology. You might be like, you know what? The first part, that was good. You should stop there. You should stop at the first part.
But that shows that the more intimate you get with the person, they're going to go to their core beliefs. And that's what I'm saying. Like over time, it just seems like the more successful he's become, the more, that's what happens with anybody. Your true belief systems come out.
Well, I think what's also happening that I wanted to point out is if you go back a number of years to his earlier lectures, they didn't have the level of vitriol in those.
Exactly, because he was beginning. And so you have to be a little bit careful and he's trying to figure his way.
Not just that, though. I think what happens I think this happens across any educator or person that develops a platform is as they develop a voice in a platform, they lean into what's making it work, right? So he gets, something blows up because he states an opinion on something. And then he goes, well, you know what? I need to give more of my opinion on that thing. And you lean into that thing until you basically are on one side of this extreme. And I see that happening here where it's like, he's leaning into the message so much that a lot of the rationality and reasoning that was there several years ago is fading behind this rhetoric that's very polarizing because it's what he's becoming successful with.
I hear everything you're saying, but I believe this guy. Like I believe, like besides the business of it, I just believe he just believes in what he believes in. Right?
I do too. But I think that what I'm saying is like every single creator, every single educator, every single person that develops a platform, they find a voice and they start leaning into it. And usually that also becomes the downfall of it, right? Because they get so extreme in their message eventually that even the people, they end up basically alienating their fan base. Because let's say that he was very much appealing to the moderates. Well, now you were super against the far left, you were appealing to the moderates, but now this conversation is going very far right. And then eventually it goes so far right that like, it's only the extreme right people that would agree with you anymore. And you've lost your fan base in the moderates and you've lost the people on the right side. And you definitely never had the left. And so I hate to break this down into like a political, and it's not political so much as to say like, when you start dialing in and getting so extreme in the message, that becomes almost the downfall because you start to alienate the very people that were resonating with what you were saying. And that's where it feels like this is going.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I just feel like his whole message is simplicity, right? I think that's why like you liked him too. Like he's very simple. And
I don't feel like he's simple.
Like, I mean, the message of like the 12 rules or
Christianity, I think in general. And I think he looks for a lot of ways to scientifically support that.
Sure. And his answer to this is a simple solution too, which is let's go back to male, female. Let's not have gender.
I'm so curious if that's what everybody heard from this.
Let's get rid of, if you don't like, let's get rid of this whole intersectionality and gender and using this cultural construct of intersections and these multi-dimensions of cultures and gender. Let's stop being ridiculous, guys. Like let's cut that shit out and let's just go back to traditional norms.
Well, we're going to find out if that's what he really means as we continue to listen to lectures, coming. But let's finish this out. We got a minute left.
It will most definitely be the case that a disproportionate number of children freed from their hypothetical gender confusion would have grown up to be physically intact and fully functional gay adults.
Okay, pause right there, because that kind of goes against what you just said. He's saying that many of these children, if they didn't get these surgical procedures, would grow up to be gay adults.
Okay.
I mean, isn't he acknowledging that like what he's basically saying is that, many of these people that were experimenting and not understanding and doing, they will grow up to identify as something that might have been different from what they thought, but they still are non-conforming. He's still acknowledging that they're non-conforming. Isn't that what that was right there? I'm playing the devil's advocate right now because
okay, we should finish it out. But maybe in this point he's saying that, but the whole construct of it, he's not saying that. Sometimes people can say really nice things, but then the core argument, like it doesn't. But anyway, yeah, why don't we finish it out?
Need I point out that this unpalatable fact makes a mockery of any claim that the extended alphabet world of the LGBTQ plus coterie in any sense constitutes a homogenous and unified community. We have crossed the line from ideological possession to active malevolence, and we are multiplying our sin. There's an intersection for you by attributing our appalling actions
it's a little extreme.
to compassion. Heaven help us.
Heaven help. So
I pick up the
So once again, once he continued his argument, he's saying this is ridiculous. The concept of the intersection. That's what he's like. The intersection. Heaven help us. Like the intersection is bullshit. This LGBTQ plus. This whole construct of being gay, like when he finished his statement, biologically and you feel gay, this is all a gender construct of bullshit. This whole intersectionality is bullshit.
That's not what I got from that. Wait, we gotta listen to that last piece again. Because like okay, here's what I heard. Here's what I heard is that we're just gonna do the last 30 seconds. This is fascinating that we have such different interpretations. Dr. Peterson, figure out what the hell you're trying to say and simplify it so we don't sit here confused and arguing over what you're trying to actually say. But what I heard was that he basically said that if you prevent prepubescent children from doing these surgeries, they will very likely grow up and discover that they're gay. They're not, non-binary. They're not, they're one of these things, but it might be not something that they thought that they were when they were 13 years old. That was the first point that I heard. The second point was that it's silly to kind of follow this entire agenda that's being set up by an LGBTQ plus community, assuming that this is a community that all believes the same thing, when in reality it's not. It's not. And I would agree with that too, that it's a bunch of different, agendas and different purposes that are kind of being blended into one concept. But that's what I took from it. Not that the identities are bullshit.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Okay, just listen to it one more time. The last little minute.
By the way, it will most definitely be the case that a disproportionate number of children freed from their hypothetical gender confusion would have grown up to be physically intact and fully functional gay adults.
Okay.
Need I point out that this unpalatable fact makes a mockery of any claim that the extended alphabet world of the LGBTQ plus coterie in any sense constitutes a homogenous and unified community.
There.
We have crossed the line from ideological possession to active malevolence, and we are multiplying our sin. There's an intersection for you by attributing our appalling actions to compassion.
Okay.
Heaven help us.
We're done. But that's what, minus the whole religious last ending piece. But that's what was that I did interpret that right? That the LGBTQ does not represent a homogenous, like unified.
Agreed. And then even if you're gay, you don't have your damaged body, right?
Yes. That he's saying that if you don't.
And anytime a person speaks, there's sometimes like things, people have moments of clarity, or people can be nice here and there because we're human, right? And then we say something, but then we ultimately go back to what we're trying to say, right? Like, I don't think like you can take something really nice, like, oh, this person being really, really nice. But at the core of it, like, that's not the whole argument. Like, people only do that when you care about someone. Like, oh come on. He just did this because like his whole point, like even when he's saying like, oh, he's not supporting gays. Like he's not saying, he's like, it's just don't kill your body. You could be gay, fine. But ultimately, this whole construct and the study of intersectionality and all these different components, and it's all splintered, it's all bullshit. All of that needs to go. If you cannot hear that, I maybe I'm crazy. I mean, I
feel like we have to. Maybe Anthony can weigh on this, but we definitely want everybody listening to weigh in on this. So jump on and actually comment, send this, because one of us is crazy right now. And you've had some really good points, which have obviously brought me to a place where I'm like, okay, yeah, I see far more religious vitriol in his rhetoric than I did before.
let me ask you this. Your argument that you just made right now, does this face look like a man that supports gay people?
That is a very judgmental.
Citing the Bible. I mean, does this look like, is this who you want representing? Like your argument that he actually wants them to be happy. Does this face look like someone that you would want to support that cause?
That is a ridiculous question. I mean, first of all, he's paused on a very angry face right now.
You could pause multiple times. It's the same face, man.
I would say he looks, in this moment, he looks like the face of someone that could be anything. Abusive. He looks like he could be, he doesn't look like a kind person. That's for sure.
I like, okay, maybe I'm like, okay, maybe I'm going crazy. What I'm hearing from him is, yes, there's a lot.
We know what you're hearing. You've said it many times. We know exactly what you're hearing. But I don't know. Maybe the reality is that it's somewhere in between what both of us are interpreting. But I don't get what you're explaining as far as like the ditching of intersection and where he stands, that this is all bullshit. I'm not picking that up at all.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So
you seem disappointed. He's like, really?
I mean, no, because maybe I'm mishearing it. Maybe I am mishearing it. Like, but that's what I'm hearing. Like, to me, his point is very clear.
Okay, I know now what we need to do going forward in this podcast. Once a month, we need to find something that is just confusing and polarizing as hell. Sit down and watch it and have a conversation about it.
And then I apologize if I interpret what he's saying wrong. I apologize to you, but that's what I'm hearing.
Well, maybe Jordan will see this and be like, you know what, Dr. Glen, I'm going to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, maybe you're going to set me straight. Yeah.
All right, guys, we hope you all enjoyed the episode. I am very curious, as I'm sure Dr. Glen is, as to your thoughts, your opinions. So like we've said, let us know. This has been a fascinating conversation and debate that we've had here. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you guys want to see more stuff like this too, or listen to more stuff like this, let us know as well. In the meantime, we are rounding out our 12-week coaching program, and we're going to be starting a new one in October, one to finish out the year. We're going to have somewhere between 15 to 20 spots, so seats are limited. It's going to go out to the wait list first, so make sure you guys are on the wait list if you want to join. And be sure to join the newsletter as well. The newsletter is on 12weekrelationships.com. This is where each week we send out some sort of tip, insight based on our conversations, our research, client experience, and just it's good stuff. It's good stuff that's going to help you in your daily life with all the relationships that you have. And this episode and the last one has been more of a little bit of entertainment value than anything. But hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Peace.
See ya.